Last winter, I decided to take a solo hiking trip in Glacier National Park. It wasn't my first time hiking in snow, but it was my first winter excursion alone. I'd always loved the quiet beauty of the wilderness, especially in the colder months when the crowds were gone, and the snow muffled everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and the mountains. The trip started well enough. The trail was well marked, the air crisp, and the snow manageable. I carried enough supplies for a 3-day trek, planning to camp at night in a lightweight tent. But on the second day, the weather turned. I checked the forecast before leaving and packed accordingly, but this storm came out of nowhere. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened, and snow was falling thick and fast, erasing the trail and blurring the line between earth and sky. I tried to backtrack to a safer spot, but the wind picked up, howling through the trees and driving the snow into my face. Visibility was almost zero. Panic started to set in. I knew I had to find shelter before nightfall, but the trees seemed endless, and the trail was long gone. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, and my breaths came out in ragged clouds as I trudged through the deepening snow. Then I saw it. A cabin. It stood out against the endless white, a small, dark structure nestled between two towering pines. The windows were frosted over, and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow, but smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Relief flooded through me. I didn't question its presence. At that moment, I was too cold and too tired to care. I staggered to the door and knocked, my fist trembling against the wood. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Finally, I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door swung open easily. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. There was a single cot against one wall, a table and chair in the corner, and shelves lined with canned goods and supplies. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" No response. I hesitated for a moment, but the warmth was too inviting. I closed the door behind me, peeled off my frozen layers, and sat by the fire, letting the heat seep into my bones. Whoever owned the cabin wouldn't mind, I told myself. They'd probably be back soon. As night fell, the storm grew fiercer. The wind rattled the windows, and snow piled against the door, sealing me inside. I tried to sleep, but a strange unease crept over me. The cabin was too quiet, the shadows too deep. The fire crackled in strange patterns, the flames flickering like they were alive. Around midnight I heard it. A knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the wind, but it was there. A steady, deliberate tapping on the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door. The knocking stopped as soon as I touched the handle. For a long moment, I stood there, listening. The wind howled outside, but there was no other sound. I opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight into the storm. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed, the world outside a swirling sea of white. I closed the door quickly and bolted it, my heart pounding. The next morning, the storm had eased, but the footprints were there. They started at the edge of the clearing and led directly to the cabin door. They were large, impossibly so, and spaced in a way that didn't make sense, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had been gliding rather than walking. I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, throwing on my frozen gear and grabbing as much food as I could carry from the shelves. The trail was still invisible, but I figured if I followed the valley downhill, I'd eventually reach the ranger station. As I stepped outside, the cabin looked different. The smoke from the chimney was gone, and the windows were dark. I glanced back once, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong. The storm picked up again as I trudged through the snow, the wind tearing at my clothes and the cold seeping into my bones. After a few hours, I stopped to rest, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was ahead of me, somehow, even though I'd been walking in the opposite direction. It looked the same as before, the same sagging roof, the same frost-covered windows. But this time, the door was open. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The snow was deeper now, each step a struggle, but I didn't dare stop. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices just out of reach. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone. I don't know how I made it out of the forest. The next thing I remember is waking up in the ranger station, wrapped in a blanket, with a medic checking my vitals. They told me I was lucky, that another hiker had found me unconscious near the trailhead. When I tried to tell them about the cabin, they exchanged uneasy glances. "There's no cabin out there," one of the rangers said. "Not for miles." I didn't argue. I didn't want to know what they'd think if I insisted. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, that faint, rhythmic knocking. And I know the cabin hasn't forgotten me. Last winter, my roommate, Jamie, and I rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway in Vermont. We both needed a break from city life, and the thought of a quiet retreat surrounded by snow-covered woods sounded like heaven. The cabin was a cozy one-room affair, perched on the edge of a frozen lake and a short hike from the nearest road. The rental agency assured us it was fully stocked and equipped for winter, so we brought minimal supplies. We arrived late Friday afternoon, just as the sun was setting behind the hills. The snow was already falling lightly, painting the landscape in soft shades of gray and white. The cabin looked picture-perfect, a quaint wooden structure with a small porch, a chimney puffing faint smoke, and a stunning view of the lake. "This is going to be awesome," Jamie said, grinning as we unloaded our bags. I smiled, but a faint unease tickled the back of my mind. Maybe it was the isolation or the way the woods seemed to press in on the cabin, but I shook it off. After all, we were here to relax. That first night was perfect. We built a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and stayed up late playing cards and laughing. Outside, the snow fell steadily, and the world felt miles away. By the time we turned in, the storm had picked up, and the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first I thought it was the wind that had stirred me, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere outside, soft but deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Jamie, wake up," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "What?" she groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. "Listen," I said. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. Jamie sat up, frowning. "It's probably just a branch hitting the cabin," she said, but even as she spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, peering through the frosted glass. The snow was falling heavily now, and the porch light barely cut through the white haze. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the tapping continued, louder now, echoing in the quiet cabin. "Don't open the door," Jamie said, her voice shaking. "I wasn't going to," I replied, but the urge to investigate was strong. Still, something about the sound made my skin crawl, like it wasn't just random noise, it was intentional. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and we managed to fall back asleep, though either of us felt rested by morning. The next day, the storm had worsened. Snow drifts piled against the cabin walls, and the lake was completely obscured by the falling flakes. We decided to stay indoors, lighting the fire and playing board games to distract ourselves. But the uneasy feeling from the night before lingered. In the afternoon, Jamie pointed out something strange. The snow outside the cabin was untouched except for a single set of footprints. They led from the tree-line to the front porch, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. "That's weird," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's the caretaker," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The rental agency had told us the cabin was self-service, with no staff on site during the winter months. By evening, the storm had grown even fiercer. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the cabin and making the fire flicker. We locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything before settling in for the night. Around midnight the tapping returned. It was louder this time, coming from multiple directions. The front door. The windows. even the roof. It felt like we were surrounded. "Who's there?" Jamie shouted, clutching the poker from the fireplace. "What do you want?" The only response was a faint whisper, carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just the storm, but as I listened, I realized it was words, indistinct and overlapping, like 100 voices speaking at once. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jamie nodded, her face pale. "It's coming from outside." The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin like a rising tide. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the air, it was in my head. Then the lights went out. The fire dimmed, casting long shadows across the room. The whispers stopped, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I saw it. A figure stood outside the window, barely visible through the frost. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face pale and featureless. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. "Do you see that?" Jamie whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward the door. The tapping resumed, louder and more frantic, as if it was trying to get in. The whispers returned, rising to a deafening crescendo. "We have to leave," I said, grabbing my coat. Jamie didn't argue. We flung the door open and ran into the storm, the snow blinding us as we stumbled through the drifts. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze pressing on my back. We didn't stop running until we reached the tree line. By some miracle, we found the path leading to the main road, though it was barely visible beneath the snow. When we finally reached the car, we climbed in and slammed the doors, panting and shaking. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It was dark now, no sign of the fire or the figure. But just before the storm swallowed it completely, I saw something in the snow, a single word, scrawled in long, jagged letters. "Stay." We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. When we told the rental agency what had happened, they were confused. "There's no cabin on that property," they said. "It burned down years ago." I didn't argue. I didn't want to know. 4 years ago, I had just taken a job as a seasonal caretaker for a small lodge in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It wasn't much, a 2-story wooden structure nestled in a valley surrounded by dense pine forests. The lodge was closed during the winter months due to heavy snow, but the owners wanted someone to stay there to prevent vandalism, monitor the property, and keep the pipes from freezing. It sounded like a perfect way to save money and enjoy some solitude. The first few weeks were uneventful. I had a generator for power, a wood-burning stove for heat, and a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The snow came down heavily most nights, but I was used to the quiet and the isolation. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. The first strange thing happened in mid-December. I was in the kitchen chopping wood for the stove when I heard it, a faint knocking sound, barely audible over the wind howling outside. At first I thought it was just a branch hitting the side of the lodge, but the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then again knock, knock, knock. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the front porch, the cold biting into my face. The snow was falling heavily, and visibility was poor, but there was no one there. The porch was pristine, the fresh snow undisturbed. I chalked it up to the wind and went back inside, but the sound lingered in my mind for the rest of the night. The next day, I found footprints in the snow outside the lodge. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and led from the tree line to the edge of the porch before disappearing. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself they were old, maybe from a hiker or hunter who had passed through before the last storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I double-checked all the locks and kept the stove burning high, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room. The knocking returned the following night. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it felt like it was coming from all sides of the lodge, moving from the front door to the windows to the back entrance. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the front door, shouting into the storm. "Who's there?" The wind swallowed my words. There was no response, just the endless whisper of snow falling through the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, every creak and groan of the old lodge setting my nerves on edge. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside to investigate. The footprints were back, circling the lodge this time, their erratic patterns zigzagging through the snow as if someone, or something, had been pacing around all night. A week later, the storm hit. I'd been monitoring the weather forecast on a small radio, and it sounded bad, a blizzard expected to last several days, with high winds and whiteout conditions. I stocked up on firewood, filled the water tanks, and prepared to hunker down. The first night of the storm, the power went out. I wasn't worried. The generator had enough fuel to last me through the week. I lit a few oil lamps, stoked the fire, and settled in with a book, the wind howling like a living thing outside. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too human. Faint voices, murmuring just beyond the walls of the lodge. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from all around me, shifting and overlapping like a chorus of the lost. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but they grew louder as the night went on. By midnight they were almost deafening, echoing through the lodge like a phantom crowd. I covered my ears and shouted, "Leave me alone!" The whispers stopped instantly. The silence was worse. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged on, the snow piling up against the windows until it blocked out the light. By morning, I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch, the world reduced to a swirling sea of white. I decided to distract myself by clearing some of the snow off the roof. I grabbed a ladder and climbed up, the icy wind cutting through my jacket. As I shoveled the snow away, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was standing at the edge of the treeline. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure was tall and thin, their silhouette barely visible through the blizzard. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. I shouted down, "Who's there? Do you need help?" No response. I scrambled back down the ladder and ran inside, locking the door behind me. When I dared to look out the window, the figure was gone, but the whispers had returned, louder and more urgent. That night, I'd barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them and keeping the axe within arm's reach. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the generator was running low on fuel. Around midnight I heard it. A scratching sound, faint at first but growing louder. It was coming from the roof. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it upward, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, something moved, a pale, gaunt hand, its fingers impossibly long, dragging itself across the shingles. I dropped the flashlight and ran, locking myself in the bedroom. The scratching grew louder, joined by the whispers, which now seemed to be coming from inside the lodge. The next morning, the storm broke. I stepped outside, trembling, the sunlight blinding after days of darkness. The footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the snow in chaotic patterns. The roof was scratched and gouged, the wood splintered as if something heavy had crawled across it. I packed my things and left that day, abandoning the lodge and its ghosts to the snow. A week later, I received a call from the owners. They'd sent someone to check on the property after I left, but when they arrived, they found the lodge empty. The doors were unlocked, the generator was off, and the fire had long since died out. The only thing they found was a single set of footprints leading from the front porch into the woods. They never came back.